So I want to talk briefly about the doctrine of annihilationism and to explain one of the reasons, well, frankly, what I think is the one biggest objection, at least from a sort of a theological and ethical standpoint, to the doctrine of annihilation. So first of all, a little bit of background. Annihilationism is a particular theory of posthumous judgment. In other words, the idea of what happens to those who are unregenerate or lost or who have rejected Christ and his offer of salvation. They refuse to be reconciled, right? The people that we traditionally say they go to hell. So what happens to those individuals? And according to the traditional, most widely held position of eternal conscious torment, or sometimes it's been called infernalism, according to that view, people, they are resurrected for a judgment that never ends. So they suffer eternally. And because they have a resurrection body, they suffer both physically and mentally. So some people actually try to take the edge off of what appears to be a very uncomfortable doctrine of eternal conscious torment by saying, well, individuals, they just suffer psychological torment, which of course really isn't a response to if you have an ethical concern about that doctrine, because yes, emotional and psychological mental suffering can be as egregious as any physical suffering. But of course, that isn't quite right, because there is in that doctrine a general resurrection. So there is also a physical body, and thus suffering being inflicted on the physical body of the individual. So theologians sometimes would call that the distinction between the pains of loss and the pains of sense. So the pains of loss would be the psychological torment that a person experiences, or the emotional, mental torment. The pains of sense would be the physical torment that an individual would experience in their bodies. And that would never end. That is the doctrine of eternal conscious torment. And it's, of course, based on several interpretations of different passages of scripture, like Matthew 25, 41 and 46, or Revelation 14, 9 to 11, or Revelation 20, among other passages. Isaiah as well, 66, talking about the worm that never dies and the fire that is not quenched, and the person lying in this horrible fire. We should keep in mind with eternal conscious torment that the images that we have, such as fire, a lake of fire, outer darkness, a furnace, weeping and gnashing of teeth, they should be interpreted as metaphors rather than literally. Often the tradition has interpreted them literally, and that's a really wooden and unnecessary approach to the texts. But even if they're metaphors, which I think they are, that hardly ameliorates or takes away the horror of the images conveyed in eternal conscious torment, because they're metaphors of a horrific mode of suffering. So then we have this other view that comes along, and that's annihilationism. And annihilationism has been a minority position in the history of the church. There's some conversation about whether Irenaeus held it in the end of the 2nd century. Arnobius appears to have held it in the 4th century. Various other theologians throughout history have held it. And it's become very popular in the latter part of the 20th century, very widespread in the Anglican Church, held by individuals such as John Stott, Michael Green, Clark Pinnock. So you could say that annihilationism has kind of gone mainstream as still a minority witness for sure, but it's also one very seriously considered. And what annihilationism does is it says, well, the suffering stops. So there's a finite experience of suffering, and so it really takes off the horror, the greater degree of horror that attends to the eternal conscious torment view of hell. Now, I want to deal, first of all, with a couple misunderstandings that are quite common about annihilationism. And once we get through those misunderstandings, we'll be able to see how there is a unique problem with annihilationism that actually you don't have, I think, really with eternal conscious torment or infernalism. So the first misunderstanding is the idea that when in annihilationism, if you're outside Christ or you've rejected Christ, then when you die, you just cease to exist. You will be no more, as the wicked are described in the Psalms. That's not actually annihilationism. That is conditional mortalism or conditional mortality, the idea that our mortality is conditional, or immortality, I should say, is conditional upon ascent to Christ, and thus if he does not give us immortality when we die, we just cease to exist, and he just allows us to lapse out of existence. Now, were that the position, that would, be a very appealing position for sure in many respects, but that's not annihilationism. The second misunderstanding, and this is really the critical one, is the misunderstanding that people think that annihilationism says, okay, so you die, and then your soul continues to exist, and you are subject to judgment, and then God snuffs you out finally and annihilates you and destroys you because you refuse to submit to him and be reconciled to him and so on. That's not also correct. So here I want to, first of all, I will say, probably one of the most important verses often cited in support of annihilationism, not a proof text, but I think it's not an insignificant one either, is Matthew 10:28, where Jesus warns about he who can destroy soul and body in hell. So there you have a destruction, not just to the body, but also to the soul or to the very life of the person. So it seems to suggest this idea of fire as a destructive agent that just consumes an individual. The thing is, however, that it is not simply a matter of suffering after death that we're talking about here. And this is the key issue and brings us to the problem that I want to talk about. It's the idea of resurrection. Let me read from from John chapter 5, verses 28 and 29. This is Jesus speaking. Do not be amazed at this, because a time is coming when all who are in the graves will hear his voice and come out. Those who have done good things to the resurrection of life, but those who have done wicked things to the resurrection of judgment. So Jesus here is echoing common first century Jewish teaching, which you find anticipated, for example, in Daniel 12:2, which also talks about a corporate resurrection of the righteous and the unrighteous. And Jesus is simply echoing that doctrine here. So he's saying there will be a future corporate resurrection of righteous and unrighteous people. What this means then is that hell is not simply a matter of you die, your soul goes on to exist and is subjected to a finite period of punishment before you're snuffed out. Rather, it is this, that you die, your soul goes on existing in an intermediate state, then your soul is resurrected with your body, re-embodied in a new resurrection body that God takes the time to give you so that he can destroy you. Now, here's the difference, okay? On eternal conscious torment, there is, within the theory, the theological and philosophical framework that underlies that theory, there are commonly assumptions. So one common assumption is that God made human beings to be immortal, so that we must continue to exist forever. Perhaps we have an immortal soul. And so the question is, will we continue to exist reconciled to God or not reconciled to God? And that's a choice that we've made, and that God simply ratifies our judgment. And then, because we are naturally embodied beings, he gives us, again, the body in order that we will be embodied beings as we are ordered to be. We're supposed to be embodied beings. He gives us that at the resurrection, and we just go on and we suffer forever. But it's a matter of the kind of being that we are, that he made us. And there's an additional issue as well with eternal conscious torment. And that is also in the theological and philosophical framework, that there's this idea of the demands of justice requiring this punishment. So it's not simply a matter of, well, you've been made immortal, you must exist forever, but it's the claim that it is fitting that you suffer in this way. You can give the illustration like this. So if you offend against different ontological levels of being, there is a greater punishment that is required. For example, if you pull the wings off of a fly, okay, that's mean. But I don't think, there's going to be any great legal or moral repercussions to that. If you torture, let's say, a squirrel or a puppy, well, now things are getting more serious. You may not go to jail, but there's certainly going to be a fine, and maybe some community service, and people are going to look at you funny. If you torture a baby, right, or hurt a baby or offend against a child or a human being, well, now you're going to jail, right? If you tortured that human being, you're going to jail. So you can see that the punishment required is commensurate with the ontological status of the entity that has been offended against. That's the idea in eternal conscious torment. I mean, in this widely held theological apparatus that defends it. And then the argument is, well, then if you offend against an infinite God, an infinite punishment is required. So because God he is not simply a finite agent, is an infinite agent. It's not that God has been harmed in the way that a being that was tortured is harmed, but nonetheless, God's honor, that was the way that Anselm talked about it, God's honor has been offended against, or you could develop some other way of describing it, but the main point is that you've offended against, acted against an ontologically infinite entity, and thus an infinite punishment is required, and thus justice requires your bodily resurrection, and then you existing and suffering forever. So eternal conscious torment. At least you can appreciate the logic of it, even if you may or may not agree with it, but that's the logic of it. But when you come to annihilationism, there is no requirement that God torture you forever, right? God can just destroy you. And there's no necessity to take the first point I just mentioned about continuing to exist forever. You do not need to continue to exist forever. Indeed, God will snuff you out. So then the question kind of forces itself. Why is there this corporate resurrection summed to judgment? In eternal conscious torment, there's a resurrection of the wicked because they are immortal beings and because justice requires their continued existence. But in annihilationism, there is no necessity for the individual to be resurrected because they are immortal necessarily, because they're not. And there's no necessity that they be resurrected because justice requires that they must suffer forever, because they need not. So then on annihilationism, why does God resurrect people forever, subjecting them to untold miseries for a finite period of time before he finally destroys them? Why go through the trouble if that is not required? And that, in short, is the problem, unique problem of annihilationism. Granted, I don't think it's a worse problem by any means than kind of the main ethical and I think theological and biblical problems with eternal conscious torment. Probably one of the biggest ones there is in eternal conscious torment in the economy of how the damned or the reprobate or some of these terrible terms that we use to refer to people who are lost and suffering forever on that model, how they relate to those who are redeemed and reconciled in the new creation to God and his creation. There's a lot of problems in thinking that through. Setting that aside, however, this is a unique problem, I think, for annihilationism, is that they posit that God resurrects people only to destroy them again. So it's kind of like, let's say, the person that was critically injured and they are nursed back to health in a hospital only to be taken in front of the firing squad and killed. And you can sort of wonder, well, what was the point of all of that? So that's the problem of annihilationism.